One night Fluffy disappeared. The girl went looking for her, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that something was wrong, that the cat could not just disappear. Under the moonlight she wandered through the dark yard, hearing only her own breathing and the creaking of twigs. She found the cat in the old barn, but the place didn't have its usual calm, just a strange, unsettling odor, and the shadow of something old and forgotten. It was like a nightmare, but with each step she realized that Fluffy was alive after all, though she had lost her former strength. Translated with dpel.com. Free version. Chapter 1. The Road to Grandma's. The sun was high in the sky when I arrived at Grandma's house. The air smelled of fresh grass and earth, a scent I always associated with summer, with freedom, and with the gentle rhythm of farm life. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped out of the car. I was back. Every summer without fail, I came here to spend time with Grandma and, of course, my beloved cat, Fluffy. She was a small, fluffy gray cat with a white spot on her chest that always seemed to shine in the sunlight. I could hear her soft meows before I even reached the front porch. Her voice, familiar and comforting, was like a welcoming hug. "Fluffy," I called out, running towards the garden. She was there, sitting by the flower bed, looking up at me with her bright green eyes. Her tail swayed lazily from side to side, and for a moment, I just stood there, smiling at her. Grandma's house always felt like the perfect place to unwind, to escape from the noise of the city. But the best part was always being with Fluffy. Grandma appeared from behind the door, wiping her hands on her apron. "Ah, there you are. I knew you'd be here soon," she said, pulling me into a warm hug. "How was the drive?" "Long," I replied, "but worth it. I missed you so much, Grandma." "And I missed you too," Grandma smiled, leading me inside. Fluffy followed us, her soft paws making no sound on the wooden floor. I set down my suitcase and looked back at her, still amazed at how gracefully she moved. As we sat down to lunch, I couldn't help but notice that Fluffy was behaving a little differently. Usually, she would jump onto the table or nuzzle into my lap, but today she just lay on her favorite armchair, watching us quietly. There was something in her gaze that I couldn't quite place. She didn't jump up to greet me like she usually did, nor did she play with the strands of yarn that I always brought with me. Instead, she just sat there, blinking slowly, as if deep in thought. "Is she okay, Grandma?" I asked, a touch of concern in my voice. Grandma, who had been watching Fluffy as well, nodded. "She's just getting older, sweetie. You know, cats slow down as they grow. But don't worry. She's still our Fluffy." I nodded, but the unease lingered in the pit of my stomach. I didn't want to admit it, but Grandma's words made me realize that Fluffy wasn't as sprightly as she once had been. Her movements were slower, more deliberate, and I noticed she spent more time napping in the sunny spots by the window than chasing after shadows like she used to. After lunch, I went outside to help Grandma with some of the farm chores. The chickens clucked around us as we collected eggs from the coop, and the goats bleated in the distance, their little hooves tapping against the dirt ground. Fluffy, as always, followed us quietly, keeping her distance. She watched the farm animals from the edge of the garden, her green eyes tracking every movement but never getting too close. Grandma handed me a bucket of water. "Here, go give the cows some fresh water," she instructed. "I'll take care of the pigs." I walked towards the barn, the warm summer breeze rustling the leaves above me. The cows were gathered in their pen, their large brown eyes looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and calm. I poured the water into their trough, watching as they drank deeply, their large muzzles splashing water everywhere. Fluffy, always curious, padded up to the barn door and peered inside. She didn't seem interested in the cows, though. Instead, her attention was drawn to a mouse scurrying near the haystack. I smiled, knowing that Fluffy still had her hunter's instincts, even if she was slowing down. She crept forward, her paws light on the barn floor, and then, just as suddenly, she stopped. It was like she was waiting, watching the mouse with intense focus. I could see the slight twitch of her tail and the glint in her eyes, and for a moment, I thought she might pounce. But then she just sat there, as if unsure, and the mouse scurried away, disappearing into a crack in the barn wall. Not today, huh? I whispered, crouching down beside her. She looked up at me, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of the playful cat she used to be. Grandma called out from the house, and I stood up. Fluffy followed me back to the garden, still as quiet as ever. We sat on the porch for a while, watching the sun begin to set. The farm was peaceful in the evenings, with only the occasional moo of a cow or the distant call of an owl breaking the silence. I looked over at Fluffy, who was curled up in her favorite spot, her eyes half closed. She seemed content, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The familiar feeling of joy that came from her playful antics and the warmth of her purring wasn't quite the same this time. I stayed up a little longer than usual that night, watching the stars from the porch swing, Fluffy nestled by my feet. It was going to be a beautiful summer. But as I looked down at her, I couldn't help but wonder just how many summers we had left together. And if this summer, with all its memories of chasing mice and running through fields, would be our last one. Chapter 2. The Secrets of Farm Life. The days seemed to stretch endlessly in Grandma's little corner of the world. Each morning, the sun would rise in a sky so blue it looked like something out of a storybook, and I would hurry to the kitchen, where the smell of fresh-baked bread and the sound of clinking pots greeted me. Grandma was always up before me, already busy with the day's chores. She never seemed to tire, moving gracefully between tasks with a rhythm that felt like second nature. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she greeted me with a smile one morning as I stumbled into the kitchen, my hair still messy from sleep. Fluffy, as usual, was sprawled on the windowsill, her tail flicking lazily as she observed the birds outside. I gave her a quick pat on the head before sitting down at the table, ready for my breakfast. Grandma set a plate in front of me, her eyes twinkling. "Today, you're going to help me with the animals. We've got lots of work to do, and you're going to learn how it's all done around here." I was eager to help. I had always loved spending time with Grandma on the farm, but now that I was older, I felt more excited than ever to learn how things worked. Grandma was a wealth of knowledge, and her stories about the farm's history were always fascinating. She had lived here her whole life, and there wasn't a corner of the farm she didn't know inside and out. After breakfast, I followed her outside, the morning air cool but promising warmth as the sun climbed higher. The first stop was the chicken coop. The hens clucked loudly as we approached, their feathers ruffling in the breeze. Grandma handed me a small bucket of feed. "Make sure to scatter it evenly, so every chicken gets some," she instructed, showing me how to spread the grain across the ground. The chickens eagerly pecked at the food, their heads bobbing up and down. I loved how they always seemed so busy and content, clucking amongst themselves in a chorus of little sounds. As I worked, I noticed Fluffy trotting behind us, her movements slow but purposeful. She wasn't getting too close to the chickens, but she clearly enjoyed watching the action from a distance. "Fluffy's always nearby when there's food," I said with a chuckle. Grandma nodded with a grin. "She's a good farm cat. She keeps the rodents at bay, though I think she's mostly here for the company." She looked down at Fluffy, who was now sitting in the shade, her green eyes following our every move. "She's a little more relaxed these days, but she's still got a good instinct for what's going on around here." After we finished with the chickens, Grandma led me to the pigsty. The pigs snorted and rooted around in the mud, their large bodies caked in dirt. It was always a noisy, smelly place, but Grandma handled it with a patience that amazed me. She showed me how to refill their water troughs and distribute their food. I laughed as one of the pigs, a particularly large one, nudged my leg with its snout, looking for attention. "Be gentle with them," Grandma cautioned. "Pigs may look clumsy, but they're smart. They'll remember you if you're kind." I patted the pig's side and then stepped back to observe as it went to munch on its food. It was funny how each animal had its own personality. The chickens were busy and chatty, the cows calm and steady, and the pigs were always so full of energy and mischief. Fluffy stayed nearby, sitting at the edge of the pen, her tail swishing slowly as she watched the pigs. I could tell she wasn't fond of them, perhaps because they were so noisy, but she wasn't about to let them out of her sight. "Fluffy's like that with every animal," I said to Grandma as we moved on to the next chore, collecting eggs from the hens that were still nesting. She always has to keep an eye on everything. Grandma chuckled. That's the way cats are. Always watching, always observing. She's a good guardian of the farm, even if she doesn't always get involved with the others. We finished our rounds with the cows. As usual, Grandma poured fresh water into their trough, and I helped with the hay. The cows were gentle and calm, their big brown eyes watching us as we worked. Fluffy, ever the observer, was sitting under a nearby tree, keeping a careful watch on the scene. As we walked back toward the house, I looked down at her. There was something comforting about having her around, even when she wasn't actively doing anything. Her presence, calm and steady, seemed to keep everything in balance on the farm. It made me feel like everything would be all right, no matter what happened. Grandma, I asked as we walked, do you think Fluffy likes being on the farm as much as I do? Grandma smiled softly, her eyes fond as she glanced at the cat. I think she loves it in her own way. Cats are independent, but they like familiarity. This farm is as much her home as it is ours. And she'll always be here, watching over us, just like she's doing now. That evening, after a full day of helping Grandma with the animals, I sat down on the porch swing with a book. Fluffy was stretched out beside me, her head resting on her paws. I thought back on everything we had done today. The chickens, the pigs, the cows. It was hard work, but it was rewarding. There was something about being close to the earth, working alongside animals, that made everything else seem so far away. Grandma joined me on the porch a little later, bringing with her a warm bowl of stew. You did a good job today, she said, handing it to me with a smile. You're getting the hang of things. I took the bowl gratefully, feeling proud of myself. Thanks, Grandma. As the day turned into night and the stars filled the sky, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The farm was peaceful, and Fluffy was still by my side. Tomorrow would bring new chores, new lessons, and more adventures. And I was ready for them. It was a life full of simple things. Feeding animals, watching the sunset, and spending time with the ones you love. But for me, this life felt like everything. And as I looked down at Fluffy, her eyes glowing in the moonlight, I knew that no matter how much time passed, I would always carry this summer with me. It was a time to learn, to grow, and to appreciate the quiet moments that made life so special. Chapter 3. The First Worry. The first signs of something being wrong with Fluffy appeared on a warm afternoon, when the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the farm. The day had started like any other. I had fed the chickens, helped Grandma water the garden, and spent time playing with the goats, who were always eager for attention. The cows, too, were in a calm mood, lazily chewing their hay as the cool breeze rustled the leaves of the trees. But Fluffy was different. She hadn't come running to greet me in the morning like she usually did, and when I called her name, there was no excited meow in response. Instead, she appeared much later in the day, but she didn't leap onto the porch or nuzzle against my legs. She simply emerged from the bushes near the barn, her movements slow and deliberate. Fluffy, where were you? I called out, but she only gave me a tired glance before curling up in the shade of the porch swing. At first, I thought nothing of it. Cats sometimes wandered off to nap in hidden spots, especially on hot afternoons. But as I went about my chores, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Usually, Fluffy was quick to follow me around, as though she wanted to keep an eye on every detail of the farm. Today, though, she didn't move much at all. She stayed in the shade, barely lifting her head to watch me. Later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I went out to the garden to check on the vegetables. The air was growing cooler, and I hoped that would encourage Fluffy to come out of her hiding spot. I called her again, but no answer. Instead, I found her lying in the same spot under the porch swing, her eyes closed as if she were sleeping. Fluffy, I whispered, kneeling beside her. I gently stroked her fur, and she didn't flinch, which was unusual. Normally, she would purr at the touch of my hand, but today, she simply remained still. I could feel her warmth under my fingers, but her body was unusually limp. I felt a pang of worry in my chest. Something wasn't right. I bent closer, inspecting her carefully. She seemed to be breathing, but her breaths were slow, shallow. The playfulness I had grown used to, the curious meows, the pouncing at shadows, was gone. In its place was a quiet stillness that made my heart ache. I stood up quickly and ran into the house to find Grandma. She was sitting by the window, knitting a scarf as the light faded from the sky. Her eyes were sharp, but when I rushed in, she looked up with concern. "Grandma, Fluffy isn't acting like herself," I said, my voice trembling. "She's lying under the porch swing, and she won't move. She's just not herself." Grandma set down her knitting and stood up slowly. "Let me go see," she said, her voice calm but filled with a hint of worry. She followed me out the door, her steps slow but steady. When we reached Fluffy, Grandma knelt beside her, running her hand through the cat's fur. Fluffy didn't respond, but Grandma's expression didn't change. She gently lifted Fluffy into her arms, cradling her against her chest like a baby. "She's just tired, sweetie," Grandma said after a long pause, her voice soft. "Sometimes cats get tired, especially when they're older. Don't worry too much, all right?" I didn't say anything. Grandma's words were kind, but I could see the concern in her eyes. She wasn't fooling me. Fluffy was more than just tired. There was something deeper going on, and I could feel it in my bones. Grandma carried Fluffy inside, placing her on the soft cushion by the fireplace. She kept an eye on her, but the rest of the evening passed quietly. Fluffy barely moved from her spot, and when I tried to give her some of her favorite treats, she only sniffed at them before turning her head away. The little purrs that I loved so much were gone. It was as if the energy had been drained from her, and no amount of coaxing could bring it back. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. Was Fluffy sick? Was she in pain? How could I help her? Grandma had always told me that animals, like people, had their own ways of dealing with things. Sometimes, she said, they just needed space. But as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't help but feel like Fluffy wasn't just dealing with something she could recover from. I didn't want to think about it, but the thought of losing her, the thought of her not being there in the morning, was too much to bear. The next morning, I was up before the sun. I crept downstairs quietly, hoping to find Fluffy in her usual spot by the window. But when I reached the living room, my heart sank. She wasn't there. I checked the kitchen, then the hallway. She wasn't anywhere inside. Panic gripped me. Where could she have gone? Was she worse than we thought? I ran outside, calling her name over and over, but there was no response. My mind raced, and my legs carried me across the yard as I searched behind the barn, the garden, and the sheds. I could feel my breath coming faster as I called out for her, my voice growing more desperate with each passing second. "Fluffy!" I yelled, looking around the farm as if she might magically appear. But there was nothing. I was about to turn back when I heard a faint sound. A soft meow, barely audible. It came from the small, overgrown area at the back of the property where Grandma's old tool shed stood. I pushed my way through the tall grass, my heart pounding. And there, nestled among the long blades of grass, was Fluffy. She was lying down, her eyes half open, but she wasn't looking at me. She was staring out into the distance, her body unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of her chest. I crouched down beside her, feeling a lump form in my throat. "Fluffy, what's wrong?" "Please, come back inside," I whispered, reaching out to touch her fur. She didn't respond. My mind raced as I gently lifted her into my arms. Her body felt warm, but heavy, like she was no longer the playful cat I remembered. My heart was heavy with fear and sadness as I carried her back to the house, silently praying that Grandma would know what to do. But deep down, I feared I already knew the answer. Chapter 4. The Night Escape. The evening air was cooler than usual as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was the kind of evening that promised a peaceful night, one where the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves would lull the farm into a deep, quiet sleep. But inside, things were far from peaceful. Fluffy hadn't moved since I brought her inside earlier that morning. She lay in the same spot by the fireplace, barely responding to my presence. Grandma had tried to comfort me, assuring me that Fluffy was just a little off, but I could see the worry in her eyes too. No one could deny it anymore. Fluffy was different. Grandma had made a bed for her in the living room, with soft blankets and a small dish of water nearby. She had even set out some of Fluffy's favorite treats, but the cat didn't even look at them. She just lay there, her eyes open but unfocused, as if she were lost in some distant world. The purring that usually greeted me when I stroked her fur was gone, replaced by a hollow silence that filled the room. I sat beside her for hours, gently stroking her fur, hoping she would respond. But the longer I sat, the more I realized that there was nothing I could do to make her feel better. Grandma was busy in the kitchen, preparing dinner, but I couldn't bring myself to join her. My thoughts were consumed with Fluffy. She was so still, so unlike the cat I had known all my life. The night stretched on, and the sounds of the farm faded into the background as I sat by Fluffy. Grandma had long since gone to bed, but I remained in the dim light of the living room, unable to sleep. My heart ached, and every time I looked at her, I felt as if something precious was slipping away. It wasn't until the clock struck midnight that something happened. Fluffy stirred. I had been sitting by the window, staring out into the dark farmyard, when I heard the faintest rustle behind me. I turned to find Fluffy standing up, her tail twitching nervously. She had been lying motionless for hours, but now she was slowly making her way toward the door, her movements stiff but determined. "Fluffy," I whispered, hardly daring to believe what I was seeing. "Where are you going?" She didn't answer. Instead, she padded softly to the door and, to my shock, scratched lightly at the wooden surface, her claws tapping with quiet insistence. I jumped to my feet. "Fluffy, no, stay inside," I pleaded, my voice tight with fear. But the cat, as if she didn't hear me, scratched again, her eyes fixed on the dark night beyond the door. There was something in her gaze, something urgent, something that told me this wasn't just a simple desire to go outside. It felt as though she was on a mission, as if something was calling to her in the night. My heart pounded in my chest as I opened the door, the cool night air rushing in. "Fluffy," I said softly, stepping outside with her. "What is it? Where are you going?" Fluffy stepped carefully onto the porch, then paused for a moment, looking back at me. Her green eyes glowed in the moonlight, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a flicker of her old self, playful, curious, and full of life. But just as quickly, the look faded, and she continued on, moving toward the far end of the farm, where the old barn stood. I followed her, unsure what to do, but feeling an undeniable pull to stay close. The moon cast a silver glow on the farm, and the air was thick with the scent of grass and earth. The sound of the night was gentle, the soft rustling of the wind in the trees and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. But tonight, there was something different. It was as if the entire farm was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Fluffy reached the barn and paused again, her head turning back to me. I stopped a few paces behind her, unsure what to expect. She was moving with purpose now, no longer dragging her feet. There was a sense of urgency in her every movement, and I couldn't help but feel like something was happening, something that I couldn't quite understand. She darted inside the barn, disappearing into the shadows. I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing, before I followed her. The barn was dark, the air thick with the scent of hay and dust. I felt my way along the wooden beams, the floor creaking under my feet. "Fluffy," I called quietly, but there was no answer. Suddenly, I heard a soft sound in the distance, a faint rustling, like something moving through the hay. I followed the noise until I found her, crouched in a corner near an old wooden crate. She wasn't alone. I gasped. There, nestled among the hay, was a small family of kittens. They were tiny, their eyes still closed, and they were curled up together, seeking warmth from each other. Fluffy sat beside them, her tail wrapped around her body protectively, her eyes watching over them with a quiet, almost solemn gaze. I knelt down beside her, my heart swelling with a mixture of awe and tenderness. "Fluffy," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "You've had kittens." Fluffy didn't respond, but there was something in her presence that told me everything I needed to know. She had brought me here for a reason. She wasn't just sick or tired. She was letting go, but in her own way, she was leaving behind a part of herself, her legacy. I reached out and gently touched one of the kittens, feeling the warmth of their tiny bodies. They were so fragile, so innocent, and yet, in that moment I understood. This was Fluffy's way of saying goodbye. She had done her part, and now it was time for the next generation to take her place. I stayed with her for hours, watching as she carefully nuzzled each kitten in turn. She didn't need to speak. Her actions spoke volumes. She was tired, but she was proud. She had given life, and now she was ready for rest. Eventually, I knew it was time to leave her alone. I stood up, my legs trembling, and turned toward the barn door. But before I left, I looked back at Fluffy one last time. She was curled up beside her kittens, her eyes half closed, as if she had done everything she needed to do. As I stepped outside and headed back toward the house, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. I didn't know what the future held for Fluffy or her kittens, but I knew one thing for sure. She wasn't just fading away. She was leaving a part of herself behind, something that would live on. And with that thought, I finally allowed myself to breathe again. Chapter 5. Friend or Foe. The days after the night in the barn passed quietly, but a change was coming to the farm. The arrival of the new dog had been expected for some time, but when it finally happened, it stirred up more than a little tension between the animals. The dog was a large, shaggy creature with a deep brown coat and dark eyes that seemed to watch everything with a keen, alert gaze. Grandma called him Max, and he was to be the new farm dog. He would help with keeping the coyotes and other wild animals away from the chickens and goats. But Max's presence was not exactly welcomed by everyone. Fluffy, for one, was having none of it. It had only been a few days since her night in the barn with her kittens, and she was still recovering from the toll it had taken on her. She spent most of her time resting inside, either near the warmth of the fire or curled up in the corner of the living room. Her movements were slower, but she was still alert, still keeping an eye on her little ones. But she was also keeping a close watch on Max, who, despite his size and energy, was still a bit unsure about his new surroundings. Max, on the other hand, was a bundle of excitement. Every morning, he would bound out the door and rush to the far side of the farm, his tail wagging furiously. At first, he seemed to have no interest in Fluffy, but that quickly changed. One afternoon, while I was playing with the goats near the pasture, I heard a loud bark from behind me. I turned just in time to see Max charging toward the porch where Fluffy was resting. Fluffy, startled, leaped to her feet and ran into the corner of the yard, her fur bristling. Max followed, his tail still wagging, but his movements were too quick, too eager. It looked like he was playing, but Fluffy didn't see it that way. She hissed sharply, her back arched, and swiped at Max when he got too close. I ran over, calling, "Max, stop!" But it was too late. The two of them were already circling each other, Max playfully wagging his tail, while Fluffy was hissing and swatting at him with fierce, quick movements. For a moment, I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Max was still a puppy at heart, and his playful energy had no ill intentions. But Fluffy, who had always been the queen of the farm, wasn't about to let him intrude on her territory without making her displeasure known. "Fluffy, stop!" I shouted, running toward her. "He's just a dog." Max, hearing my voice, immediately stopped, his ears drooping slightly. But Fluffy wasn't ready to let go of her defensive stance. She was still hissing and swatting at him, not giving him a chance to get closer. I knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on her back. "Fluffy, it's okay," I whispered, trying to calm her down. But she wasn't having it. She was too upset, too protective of her kittens. She wasn't about to let this large, noisy creature get too close to them. Max, looking a bit confused now, sat down a few paces away, his eyes still fixed on Fluffy. His tail wagged a little, but he didn't make a move. He was waiting for a sign, any sign, that he could approach again. I sighed, feeling a little helpless. "Max, go lie down," I said firmly, pointing toward the far corner of the yard. He hesitated for a moment, then obeyed, trotting off to the area by the barn where he'd been spending most of his time. I turned back to Fluffy, who was still on edge but had started to relax a little now that the immediate threat had passed. I gently stroked her fur, her sharp body softening under my touch. "Good girl," I murmured, trying to reassure her. She didn't like being challenged, and Max's sudden appearance had definitely thrown her off balance. She wasn't used to sharing the farm with another animal, especially one as big and energetic as Max. But I had a feeling she would come to accept him, in her own time. The next few days were filled with tension. Fluffy would watch Max from a distance, her green eyes tracking every movement he made. Max, for his part, tried to be as gentle as possible, giving her space but still looking at her with curiosity. Whenever they crossed paths, Fluffy would hiss at him, reminding him who was in charge. But Max didn't seem to mind. He would simply wag his tail and back off, eager to please but not quite understanding why she was so upset. It wasn't until one afternoon, when I was feeding the chickens near the barn, that I saw a real shift in their behavior. I had just finished scattering some grain for the chickens when I heard the sound of paws padding softly on the dirt path. I turned to find Max walking toward me, his head lowered, his posture relaxed. He wasn't charging at Fluffy this time, nor was he trying to play. He was simply walking calmly, his tail wagging gently behind him. Fluffy, who had been sitting in the shade nearby, watched him carefully. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't make a move to swat at him this time. Instead, she stayed perfectly still, as if waiting for Max to approach on his own terms. Max stopped a few feet away from her, sitting down in the grass. His gaze remained on Fluffy, but this time there was no aggression in his posture. He was waiting for permission. Fluffy watched him for a long moment, her ears twitching. Then, to my surprise, she slowly stood up and walked over to him. She stopped just short of where Max was sitting, her body tense but not defensive. She sniffed the air around him, studying him closely. Max remained still, not daring to make a sound. It was as if he understood that this was Fluffy's moment to decide. After a long pause, Fluffy gave a small, deliberate nod and took a step closer. Her tail flicked once, but she didn't hiss. And for the first time, Max didn't back away. Instead, he carefully stood up and gently licked her on the ear, as if offering an apology for their earlier encounter. Fluffy didn't pull away. Instead, she stood there, her head held high, allowing Max to get closer. Slowly, cautiously, she seemed to acknowledge him, not as an enemy, but as a fellow creature on the farm. I watched in amazement. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was the beginning of something new. The uneasy tension between them was beginning to fade, replaced by a sense of mutual respect. Fluffy wasn't ready to be his best friend, but she was willing to share the farm with him, just as she had once shared it with me. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. Fluffy kept her distance, but she no longer hissed at Max when he wandered nearby. And Max, for his part, seemed content to keep his distance from her as well, occasionally glancing at her with a look of curiosity and respect. It wasn't exactly friendship, but it was a start. I couldn't help but smile as I watched the two of them, so different but so similar in their ways. Fluffy was old and wise, and Max was young and eager to please. But both of them, in their own way, had a place on this farm. And as I watched the sun dip below the horizon, I knew that they would both learn to share it, just as the farm had always shared its bounty with all of us. The days would pass, and more lessons would be learned. But for now, it was enough to know that, despite their differences, Fluffy and Max were finding a way to coexist. And I couldn't have been more proud of them both. Chapter 6. Days full of sun. The last few weeks of summer passed in a quiet rhythm, and each day felt like a gentle repeat of the one before. Sunny mornings, the sound of the roosters crowing, the peaceful moo of the cows in the meadow, and the occasional bleat of the goats. The farm, in its simplicity, became a place where time slowed down, allowing me to savor every moment. Fluffy, though still moving a little slower than before, was spending more time outside, especially in the afternoons. Her kittens, tiny balls of fur, had grown rapidly, their eyes now wide open and their tiny paws exploring their surroundings. It amazed me how quickly they changed, each day bringing new discoveries. Fluffy seemed content with them, watching over them with a quiet pride. She would occasionally nudge one of her little ones when they ventured too far, guiding them gently back to the safety of the warm barn. Max, too, had settled into the rhythm of the farm. His earlier attempts to chase the chickens now replaced by a more peaceful coexistence with the animals. He had become a reliable presence, always nearby when Grandma was in the garden, or when I was out feeding the animals. Despite his boisterous energy, he had learned to give Fluffy and her kittens their space. And although Fluffy was still cautious around him, I could see the beginnings of an understanding forming between them. But it wasn't just the animals that had settled into a peaceful routine. My days, too, were filled with simple pleasures. Each morning, I would wake early, long before the sun had fully risen, and walk to the barn with Grandma. The air was always cool then, and the farm felt alive in a way it didn't later in the day. Grandma would sing softly to herself while she collected the eggs, her voice mingling with the birds' early morning songs. I would sit with her, watching the chickens, my fingers tracing patterns in the dirt as we worked. Afterward, I'd head to the goats. I loved brushing their thick, soft coats while they nibbled on clover. They would lean into me as I brushed them, their heads gently bumping against my arms, and I'd laugh as one of the younger goats would start butting me playfully, trying to get my attention. And then there were the ducks, who would follow me around the yard, waddling behind me like a group of overzealous little soldiers. I would scatter crumbs for them, and they would eagerly peck at the ground, quacking happily. Fluffy, who had always been more of a solitary creature, never came too close to the ducks, but she would often sit a distance away, watching me as I interacted with them. I liked to think that she enjoyed observing the joyful chaos of the little ducklings, even if she would never join in. The best part of each day, though, came in the late afternoon when the sun began to set. Grandma would call to me from the porch, asking if I was ready for a glass of lemonade or a piece of freshly baked pie. I would set down whatever task I had been doing and hurry back to the house, eager to spend a few quiet hours on the porch with her. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a glass of lemonade in hand, I noticed Fluffy sitting a few feet away, her kittens clustered together at her side. Max was lying in the grass nearby, his tail lazily swishing back and forth. The whole scene seemed to glow in the warm, golden light of the setting sun. It was in that moment that I realized how much had changed since I had arrived. The animals, the farm, and even the land itself had a way of settling into their own rhythms, finding balance in the most natural of ways. Fluffy, though still older and slower, had found peace in her new role as a mother. Max, the newcomer, had found his place among us. And me, well, I had found a kind of contentment in the simplicity of life here, away from the noise and rush of the city. As I sipped my lemonade, I could hear the distant sound of the cows lowing in the field, the soft cluck of the chickens as they settled down for the night, and the soft chirping of crickets. The evening felt peaceful, a perfect end to another warm, sun-filled day. Fluffy stood up, stretching her limbs gracefully before she moved toward her kittens. They were already starting to play, their tiny bodies tumbling over each other in a flurry of soft fur and tiny meows. I smiled as I watched them, my heart swelling with affection. Fluffy had always been the protector, the silent watcher of the farm, but now, I could see how much joy her little ones brought her. It was as though the farm itself had given her this new purpose, this new role, and she embraced it with all the quiet grace she had always shown. I couldn't help but wonder what the future held for all of us. Fluffy, her kittens, Max, and me. Summer was slowly beginning to fade, the days growing shorter and the air growing cooler. But for now, everything felt perfect. The farm, the animals, the life I had here, it was all I had ever needed. I was content. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, I watched as Fluffy curled up with her kittens, her tail gently wrapping around them. Max, who had been lying in the grass, stood up and trotted over to lie at the foot of the porch, his eyes still trained on the kittens. I could see the beginning of the bond forming between him and Fluffy's little ones. There was no rush, no urgency, just the slow, steady passing of time, like the soft ebb and flow of the farm's quiet life. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I needed to be anywhere else. The future could wait. For now, I was exactly where I was meant to be. As the light faded and the evening grew darker, I sat back, feeling the warmth of the summer air around me. The farm was peaceful, the world was still, and in that moment, it felt like everything was just as it should be. Chapter 7. A sign from nature. The evening before the storm came, the air felt different. It was thick and heavy, charged with a kind of electricity that made everything seem on edge. The sky had been clouding over all afternoon, the bright blue of the day turning into deep shades of gray. The wind picked up in the late afternoon, rustling through the trees and kicking up dust along the dirt paths. I had been watching the sky from the porch, feeling a sense of anticipation in the air, though I couldn't quite explain why. Fluffy had been restless all day. She paced back and forth, her usually slow movements now quick and jerky. Her green eyes, usually so calm and steady, flickered with an unease that I had never seen before. She kept her kittens close, constantly nudging them back to the warmth of the barn whenever they ventured too far. I had always been taught to watch the animals when the weather turned, for they could sense things that humans couldn't. Grandma often told me stories of how the animals would behave before a storm, how the cows would stay close to the barn, how the birds would fly low, and how even the cats would grow still, as if waiting for something. But this time, it was different. Fluffy wasn't just pacing, she was anxious, her tail flicking nervously behind her. I watched her for a long time, my heart heavy with a strange sense of worry. It wasn't long before I noticed that the sky had turned an almost unnatural shade of purple, the wind picking up with greater force, sending the trees swaying and the grass bending low. The storm was coming, and it was coming fast. I could hear the distant rumble of thunder, low and ominous, rolling across the sky. Fluffy stood at the edge of the porch, her body tense, her tail flicking sharply from side to side. She was staring out toward the barn, her gaze fixed and unwavering. "Fluffy," I called softly, stepping toward her. She didn't respond, her focus entirely on the distance, her body taut with anticipation. The wind picked up again, and I felt the temperature drop by several degrees. The first heavy raindrops began to fall, hitting the earth with a sharp patter. The storm was nearly upon us, but Fluffy didn't move. Instead, she stood still, her eyes narrowed as if she was waiting for something. I felt a sudden tug in my chest, a sense of urgency that I couldn't shake. Something wasn't right. Before I could even fully process the thought, Fluffy darted off the porch, her paws kicking up dirt as she ran toward the barn. She moved with a speed I hadn't seen in weeks, her body graceful despite the growing storm. I followed her quickly, my heart racing as I tried to keep up. By the time I reached the barn, the rain was coming down in sheets, the wind howling through the trees, bending the branches under its force. The barn door creaked on its hinges, and I hurried inside, squinting through the darkness to make out Fluffy's form. She was at the back of the barn, curled up protectively around something. At first, I thought she had simply found a safe place to wait out the storm, but as I drew closer, I realized what she was guarding. Kittens. Her kittens. But there was something else. A soft, rhythmic sound filled the air. Tiny mews, faint and weak, as if they were barely able to make a sound at all. Fluffy's tail flicked gently, almost soothingly, as she pressed her body closer to her little ones. The kittens were all nestled together, their fur damp from the rain that had already started to seep into the barn. But what truly caught my attention was the presence of a new, tiny kitten. It wasn't one of the kittens I had seen before. This one was different, smaller, weaker. It lay curled up beside the others, barely moving, but its eyes were already wide open, and it was trying to crawl toward its mother. My heart skipped a beat as I knelt down beside Fluffy, my fingers trembling as I reached out to gently stroke the soft fur of the newborn. It was so small, so fragile, and yet there it was, fighting to survive in the world, even as the storm raged outside. Fluffy didn't seem surprised by the new addition. Instead, she gently nudged the little kitten closer to her body, her green eyes looking up at me as if to say, "This is what I've been waiting for." The storm outside grew fiercer, the wind rattling the barn and the rain beating down on the roof in a deafening rhythm. But inside the barn, it was calm. It was as though time itself had slowed, as though the storm was merely a backdrop to this quiet, sacred moment. I sat with Fluffy for a long time, my hand resting gently on her back as she nursed her kittens, the new one nestled carefully among them. The warmth of the barn, the soft glow of the dimming light from the outside, and the rhythmic sound of the storm combined to create an almost otherworldly peace. As the storm raged on, I thought about how much Fluffy had changed over the course of the summer. She had always been the solitary one, the watchful protector of the farm, but now, with the arrival of her kittens, she had become something else entirely. A mother, a provider, a keeper of life. And in that moment, I realized that the storm wasn't just a weather event. It was a sign. A sign of life, of change, of growth. The storm passed through the night, and by morning, the air was clear, the sky bright and blue once again. The barn was quiet now, save for the soft mews of Fluffy's kittens, and the farm seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. When I went to check on them the next morning, Fluffy was still curled up with her little ones, her body protectively surrounding them. She looked up at me with those green eyes of hers, and I could almost hear her silent message. Everything is as it should be. The storm had come and gone, leaving the farm in peace. And now, in the quiet aftermath, life would continue. The kittens were growing stronger, their tiny bodies stretching and moving more each day. And Fluffy, though older now, was content. Her role as a mother now taking precedence over everything else. And as for me, I knew that this was a lesson I would carry with me. Life, like the storm, was unpredictable and wild. But in the end, it was also beautiful, full of new beginnings and quiet moments of understanding. I watched Fluffy curl back up with her kittens, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face as I stood in the doorway of the barn. The storm had passed, but its mark would remain, a reminder that change, though often frightening, could also bring new life, new beginnings, and a deeper connection to the world around us. And for Fluffy, her new journey had only just begun. Chapter 8. Grandma's Lessons. The summer had drawn to a close, and the days were getting shorter, the air turning cooler with each passing morning. It was the kind of time when the world seemed to slow down, as if preparing for the quiet of autumn. The farm was still busy, but there was a shift in the air. Things were winding down, the pace of life becoming a little more reflective. I had noticed it more in the past few days. The change in Fluffy. She had always been graceful and independent, but lately, she had been moving slower than usual, and I could sense that her energy was not what it used to be. She still tended to her kittens, but now she often took long naps in the sun, curling herself up in a quiet corner of the barn, her eyes half closed as she rested. Her movements were more deliberate, her once quick reflexes not quite as sharp as they had been just a few weeks ago. I hadn't wanted to admit it, but I knew in my heart what was happening. Fluffy was getting older. The realization settled in like a soft, heavy weight, and I couldn't push it away anymore. Grandma must have noticed, too, for she had become more reflective in her conversations, often speaking of the changing seasons and the cycles of life. She had a way of talking about things that made them feel natural, as if they were simply part of the world's great design. She would sit with me on the porch in the evenings, the cool air brushing across our faces, and tell me stories of the animals she had known throughout her life. Sometimes, she spoke of the farm's past, the generations of animals and people who had come before us, and sometimes she just spoke about life itself, its inevitable changes and its quiet beauty. It was one of those evenings when she said something that would stay with me forever. We were sitting on the porch, sipping warm tea as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. I had just finished feeding the animals for the evening, and my hands were still a little damp from the work. The kittens were playing at the edge of the porch, their tiny paws batting at a ball of yarn, while Fluffy lay nearby, her eyes closed in quiet slumber. Grandma watched them for a long time, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know, sweetie," she began, her voice soft but steady. "Animals live their lives in cycles, just like everything else in nature. They come into the world, grow up, and eventually, they grow old. And when that time comes, they know it's their turn to let go." I looked at Grandma, unsure of what she meant. The words hung in the air between us, like a question I hadn't yet asked. "Fluffy is getting older," Grandma continued. "And like all creatures, She will eventually pass on. It's just the way of things. But we don't mourn for them when their time comes. Instead, we celebrate the time we had together. We remember the joy they brought into our lives. My chest tightened at the thought. The idea of losing Fluffy, of saying goodbye, felt impossible. She had been with me through so much, and the thought of her not being there felt like a heavy shadow hovering over the peaceful life we had built together. "But Grandma," I asked quietly, "how do you know when it's time? How do you know when to let go?" Grandma gave me a gentle smile, her eyes soft and wise. "It's not always something we can see right away, sweetie. Sometimes it's a feeling, something we know deep down. When the time comes, we don't force it. We give them space to go at their own pace, and we hold on to the memories, the good ones, the ones that make us smile. It's not about letting go in sadness, but in peace, in knowing that their love will stay with us forever, even when they're no longer here." I nodded, though the thought still felt difficult to accept. Fluffy had always been so strong, so full of life, and to think of her being anything less than that was almost impossible. But Grandma's words, as gentle as they were, gave me a sense of comfort. It wasn't about holding on to something forever. It was about cherishing what had been and accepting that change, even when it was hard, was part of the beauty of life. That night, after Grandma had gone to bed, I stayed outside for a while longer, looking up at the stars. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after a storm has passed, when everything seems still and at rest. Fluffy had curled up on her favorite blanket in the barn, her kittens nestled against her side, and I watched them for a long time, trying to memorize the sight, the soft rise and fall of Fluffy's breathing, the quiet purr that rumbled deep in her chest as she slept. The next morning, the sky was clear, and the sun shone bright, but there was a chill in the air that made the day feel different. As I went to feed the animals, I noticed that Fluffy wasn't in the barn where I had left her the night before. I felt a pang of worry in my chest, but when I walked into the yard, I found her sitting in the shade of the old oak tree, her eyes closed, her tail wrapped around her paws. She looked at me then, her green eyes meeting mine with a calmness that took my breath away. It was as if she was telling me she was ready for whatever came next, but she was at peace. Her time had come, and she was no longer in any rush. I knelt beside her, my fingers brushing through her soft fur one last time, and I whispered a quiet goodbye. The warmth of her fur was comforting, the steady rhythm of her breath reassuring me that it was okay, that she would always be with me in my heart. Later that day, Grandma and I went to the old garden behind the house, and as we worked together, she said, "We don't keep our loved ones with us out of fear, my dear. We carry them in our hearts, where they'll always be alive, as long as we remember them." That evening, as the sun set and the sky turned golden, I sat on the porch, watching the animals as they settled down for the night. Fluffy was no longer there, but I could feel her presence, in the gentle evening breeze, in the soft rustling of the leaves. She had taught me so much, and now it was my turn to let go. Not in sorrow, but in love, knowing that she would always be with me, just as Grandma had said. The farm, the animals, and the love that had filled the air for so many summers would continue. And with each new season, I would carry the memory of Fluffy with me, a quiet reminder that life, in all its beauty, was always about change, and about knowing when to let go. Chapter 9. Farewell. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting soft pink and golden hues across the sky as I walked down the familiar path toward the barn. The cool morning air was filled with the scent of fresh grass and dew, but there was a heaviness in my heart that I couldn't shake. It felt like something important had already happened, something that had shifted in the quiet of the night. I had gone to bed the night before with a quiet ache in my chest, but I didn't know what it meant, not really. I had kept thinking about Fluffy, about how she seemed to be fading a little more each day. Her movements had grown slower, her eyes more distant, though she still followed me around the farm, always keeping a careful watch over her kittens. When I got to the barn, I paused outside, the door creaking softly in the wind. I didn't want to look inside, didn't want to face the truth that had been looming over us all summer. But something pulled me forward, and with a deep breath, I pushed open the door. The sight that greeted me was one I wasn't prepared for. Fluffy was curled up in her favorite spot, the same spot she had always gone to for rest. The corner of the barn, where the morning light filtered through the cracks in the walls, illuminating her fur in a warm, gentle glow. She was lying peacefully, her body still, her tail wrapped neatly around her paws, just as she had always done when she was at peace. But this time, there was no soft purring, no slow rise and fall of her chest. The stillness in the air was profound, and in the quiet of the barn, I could feel the weight of the moment settle over me. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped forward, my feet silent on the hay-covered floor. I knelt beside her, my heart racing in my chest as I reached out to touch her. Her fur was cool, her body stiff, but she was peaceful. In her own way, Fluffy had chosen to leave quietly, just as she had lived, on her own terms, without fear or struggle. It wasn't something I could explain, but there was a sense of calm in the air around her, as though she had simply slipped into a deep sleep, one that she would not wake from. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I gently placed my hand on her head, stroking her soft fur for the last time. It was hard to imagine a world without Fluffy in it, without her quiet presence watching over the farm, but I knew deep down that she was ready. She had given me everything she had, and now it was time for her to rest. I could hear the faint sound of the kittens stirring nearby, their tiny mews a soft background to the sadness that hung heavy in the barn. Fluffy's kittens were growing, their small bodies becoming more active each day, but they were still so young, so dependent on their mother. I looked at them, wondering how they would grow without her. Would they remember her? Would they carry her spirit with them as they learned to explore the world? As I sat there, lost in thought, Grandma appeared in the doorway, her expression calm but knowing. She had sensed it, just as I had. We didn't speak at first. She simply came over and sat beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder in silent support. After a long while, Grandma spoke softly. She was ready, my dear. She had lived her life the way she wanted, and now she is at peace. I nodded, my heart aching. It was hard to let go, harder than I ever imagined. But Grandma was right. Fluffy had lived her life fully, with grace and dignity, and now it was time to say goodbye. Grandma helped me gather some of the soft hay and flowers from the garden, and together, we carefully laid Fluffy to rest beneath the old oak tree outside the barn. The morning light bathed the ground in a soft glow, and the air was still and peaceful. As we finished, I felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over me. Fluffy had given me so much. Her companionship, her protection, her quiet love. And now it was time for me to honor her by letting go. We sat together for a while, the soft sounds of the farm around us, and I felt a sense of calm settle in my heart. Fluffy's spirit was with me, and she always would be, in the memories we shared, in the lessons she had taught me, and in the love she had given so freely. The day passed slowly, and I kept busy with the usual chores around the farm, but the weight in my chest never fully lifted. It was hard to imagine that I wouldn't see Fluffy again, that she wouldn't come to find me in the barn or curl up next to me in the evenings. But in the quiet moments, I could almost feel her presence, as though she was still watching over the farm, still with me in some way. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, I stood on the porch with Grandma, the last light of day casting long shadows across the farm. The kittens were playing near the barn, and I could see that they were starting to find their way without Fluffy. They were growing stronger, more independent, just as she had once been. "We'll take care of them," Grandma said softly, as if reading my thoughts. "We'll raise them, just like we did with her." I nodded, knowing that the farm would continue, that life would go on. But there would always be a space in my heart for Fluffy, a space that no one else could ever fill. She had been my constant companion, my friend, and in many ways, she had taught me more than I could have ever expected. She had shown me the importance of love, patience, and the acceptance of the inevitable changes in life. As we watched the stars begin to twinkle in the sky, I whispered a quiet goodbye to Fluffy, knowing that she was now part of the night, part of the earth, part of the farm we had shared together. "Thank you, Fluffy," I whispered into the cool night air. "I'll never forget you." And in that moment, I felt her presence one last time, not in the way I had always known her, but in the peace and quiet that surrounded me. She was gone, but she would live on in my heart, always. Chapter 10. Fluffy Lives in the Heart. The summer had come to an end, and the days were growing shorter, the air cooler, but the farm still carried the warmth of everything that had been. Life had continued as it always did. But now there was a quiet space where Fluffy's presence had once been. It wasn't just the absence of her soft fur against my legs as I walked through the barn, or the way she would always greet me with a gentle meow when I returned from feeding the other animals. It was something deeper, something that stretched into the heart of the farm itself. Grandma and I had spent the last few days together, taking care of the animals, finishing up the last of the harvest, and preparing the farm for the colder months ahead. The kittens had grown stronger, and though they missed their mother's guidance, they were finding their way. They still snuggled close to one another at night, but their playful mews had grown more confident, their small paws learning to pounce and explore. But there was always the quiet presence of Fluffy in the back of my mind. I would often catch myself glancing around the barn, expecting to see her curled up in her favorite spot, or even waiting by the door when I returned from my chores. And when I went to bed at night, I would still expect to hear her soft purring drifting from the barn, but the silence that followed was louder than any sound. Yet, in the stillness of the farm, I had begun to feel something else, something that filled the emptiness. It was as if Fluffy had left behind a kind of light, a warmth that seemed to settle over the land, comforting me in ways I hadn't expected. It was the memory of her love, her gentle nature, and the way she had always been there for me. One afternoon, I was sitting on the porch, watching the golden light of autumn stretch across the fields, when Grandma came out with a basket of apples from the orchard. She sat down beside me, and we didn't say anything for a long while. The air was cool, but the sun still held its warmth. It was the kind of day when everything seemed just right, even in its quiet simplicity. Grandma broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. "You know, sweetie," she began, "Fluffy didn't just leave us. She gave us something, too. She gave us all the love and care she had, and now it's our turn to carry that love forward." I looked at Grandma, unsure of what she meant, but she simply smiled and handed me an apple. We sat together, each lost in our own thoughts, but the meaning of her words slowly began to settle in my heart. After a few moments, I stood up and walked over to the barn. The kittens were chasing each other around the hay, their tiny paws batting at the balls of yarn I had left for them. I smiled softly, watching them play, and for the first time since Fluffy's passing, I didn't feel the ache in my heart. Instead, I felt a warmth, a sense of peace. Fluffy's legacy was in these little creatures, in the way they explored the world with such joy, with such freedom. They were growing, and they carried her spirit in every playful leap and tumble. I knelt down beside them, and one of the kittens, a little tabby with bright green eyes, nuzzled my hand as if to say, "We're okay." The others stopped to look up at me, their tiny faces full of curiosity, and I felt an overwhelming sense of love wash over me. Fluffy had given them to me, and through them, she was still here. The kittens needed care, and I would give it to them, just as Fluffy had given me all her love and care. The lessons she had taught me about kindness, patience, and the importance of life's fleeting moments would stay with me forever. She had shown me the beauty in every quiet day, in every little action, and now it was my turn to share those lessons with the new generation she had left behind. Later that afternoon, Grandma and I went to the garden to pick some vegetables for dinner. The evening sun was casting long shadows across the land, and the farm seemed to be glowing in the soft light. As we worked, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for all that had been, for the love that had filled these fields, and for the quiet moments of understanding that had come with the passing of Fluffy. "We carry the ones we love with us, always," Grandma said as we walked back toward the house, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. "Their love doesn't go away. It stays with us in the things we do, in the way we live our lives. That's how we keep them with us." I nodded, her words settling in my heart. It was true. Fluffy would always be with me, not in the physical sense, but in the love I carried for her, in the memories we had shared, and in the lessons she had taught me. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about all the moments I had spent with Fluffy. The way she would curl up next to me on chilly mornings, the way she would follow me around the farm, always watching over me with her wise eyes. I could still feel her presence in the quiet of the barn, in the soft sounds of the kittens as they slept, and in the gentle evening breeze that swept through the trees. I closed my eyes, a smile tugging at my lips as I whispered into the night, "Thank you, Fluffy. I'll never forget you." And in that moment, I knew she would never be truly gone. Her love had become part of me, woven into the very fabric of my life. And no matter where I went, no matter how far the seasons took me, she would always be with me. In my heart, in my actions, and in the love I gave to the world. As the stars twinkled above, I felt at peace. Fluffy had given me everything I needed to carry on, to love, to care, to live each day with gratitude for the simple, beautiful moments that made life so precious. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift she could have ever given me. Fluffy would live on in my heart forever.